An innocent man is free thanks to crime-fighting genes.
It's revolutionized forensic science.
And without it, I would still be there.
The directions for a human being are written in code, 3 billion letters long. These instructions tell our bodies how to live, how to grow, how to die. Researchers call this code the sequence.
Welcome to Secrets of the Sequence. I'm Lucky Severson. Recently, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. added some new genes to its collection. They include photographs of DNA sequences believed to belong to O.J. Simpson, taken during what was called the trial of the century in 1995. This genetic evidence was very controversial and helped get Simpson acquitted of murder. It also drew the nation's attention to what was then a pretty new forensic method, DNA profiling. But let's back up a bit. Forensics is the application of science to legal problems, and there's nothing new about that. Let's turn to our Hitchhiker's Guide to the Genome for a history lesson.
In the early 1900s, an Austrian professor discovers that blood cells fall into different groups. These groups are eventually labeled as types A, B, AB, and O. In 1917, William M. Marsden invents the first lie detector test, claiming he can detect verbal deception by measuring an increase in systolic blood pressure.
Well, thank you so very, very much. While we've been investigating crimes for centuries, it's been less than 20 years since genetics revolutionized the criminal justice system. In 1984, British geneticist Alec Jeffreys developed DNA profiling, and it's been shaking up the process of solving crimes ever since. Today, Kirk Bloodsworth is a free man, making his living on his fishing boat on the Chesapeake Bay. But only a few years ago, Kirk was on the state of Maryland's death row, waiting to be executed for a crime he didn't commit. In the summer of 1984, a young girl was raped and murdered in Kirk's neighborhood. Authorities were sure Kirk had done it. He lived near the crime scene, and he looked like a police sketch of the suspected killer.
Well, I didn't know what to think. I'll tell you the truth, I was in utter shock and disbelief by the whole thing. I really can't explain it other than, I knew that it was wrong and they shouldn't be doing this. But the problem with that is that nobody would listen to me. It was almost like I was a non-party to it, although I was the center of it all.
Kirk was a former U.S. Marine who had never been in serious trouble with the law, but he was convicted of rape and murder and was sentenced to die in the gas chamber. He was 23 years old.
You're in your cell by yourself, and every day you wake up, it's another day closer that they're going to walk you to the gas chamber and to your last breath, and you're waiting to die. I can't even begin to articulate the anguish that you endured during that process. It's brutal on the soul.
Kirk spent 2 years on death row before his sentence was reduced to life in prison. He kept hoping someone would believe he was innocent. For 9 years, almost no one did, until DNA profiling came along.
About DNA profiling. DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, is the molecule responsible for every person's genetic makeup. It is composed of 4 nucleotide bases, arranged in a double helix or spiral. DNA is in virtually every cell in the human body. With the exception of identical or monozygotic twins, no two people have the same DNA. Since each person's DNA sequence is unique, DNA evidence collected from a crime scene can link a suspect to a crime or eliminate one from suspicion in the same way that fingerprints are used. This is called a DNA profile.
In prison, Kirk read a book about how DNA testing in England had helped police find a killer. He was sure it could help him too, in a different way.
I felt that if it could prove somebody did it, it could also prove that they didn't do it.
When Kirk was sentenced back in 1985, biological samples weren't tested for DNA. But by the early 90s, forensic scientists could test for it, even very small amounts. When a semen stain on the murdered girl's clothing was tested, it came back negative for Kirk's DNA. He was pardoned and became the first death row inmate ever to be freed by DNA evidence.
The real killer is still out there. And all this won't be complete until the real one is behind bars.
With the advent of the DNA technology, it's revolutionized forensic science, at least to the extent that fingerprints did 100 years ago. It's easily one of the single most important revolutions in forensic science in the last 2 decades.
Paul Ferrara is director of Virginia's Division of Forensic Sciences. He says DNA technology has changed almost every aspect of law enforcement, from the crime scene to the courtroom.
They're changing the way they look at potential evidence. Anything that might contain some biological remnant of an individual is being collected, and it can be dental floss, toothbrushes, hairbrushes, you name it. If it's been in contact with a perpetrator, it's entirely possible for us to develop a DNA profile. 10 years ago, they wouldn't even conceive of collecting something like that.
Authorities now have stacks of evidence to test. They look for hair, saliva, blood, or semen. Anything that might yield DNA. Even microscopic quantities are sufficient for testing.
In the early days of DNA technology, you'd require a blood stain the size of a quarter to get a DNA profile. With the advent of the new technologies today, we're able to develop a DNA profile from material that can't even be seen with the naked eye.
The most common type of DNA analysis today uses PCR, which stands for polymerase chain reaction. PCR allows investigators to analyze evidence that couldn't be tested before because there wasn't enough DNA or it was of poor quality. PCR copies the DNA over and over again, a kind of chemical Xeroxing. This amplification process creates enough DNA to generate a profile. But with small amounts of DNA, a sample is easily contaminated. That's when DNA from an outside source gets mixed up with the DNA being tested. It can happen when someone sneezes on a sample or handles it with bare hands. Contamination of evidence was one of the many charges made by the O.J. Simpson defense team. But even if a sample is contaminated, scientists say the original DNA is still around.
There's nothing in DNA testing that would allow an examiner to mistakenly identify one DNA profile as belonging to someone else. If you contaminate a sample, you have just introduced a second DNA profile on top of the original. It doesn't change the DNA profile.
All lab workers in Virginia have their own DNA profiles on record. So if their DNA has contaminated a sample, they can identify it. But how do you decide whose DNA it is? Well, it turns out that while we're nearly 100% the same, there are a few sections of our genetic code where we differ quite a bit. 13 of those spots are typically used to generate a DNA profile.
In recent years, all of the forensic science community in the U.S. and most of the forensic community around the world use these same genetic markers. These portions of DNA are called STRs, or short tandem repeats. They're portions of the DNA sort of between the actual genes.
The real investigative power of DNA is in cases where there is no suspect. This CODIS database contains DNA profiles from convicted criminals. Authorities link unknown DNA left at a crime scene with the DNA in the database. Sometimes they find a perfect match, what's called a cold hit.
We develop a DNA profile from the evidence in this case and then search the database against convicted offenders. And the computer search finds that an individual in the database actually is completely matching the profile from the evidence, and then we are able to give the police a name of an individual to go talk to investigate further, helping them solve the case when they have no idea where to look or who committed the crime.
And DNA, like justice, is blind. If you're guilty, it's your worst enemy. If you're innocent, it's your best friend.
I would say the DNA was a magic wand for me. It's a magic wand for any innocent man, but it'll be your damning thing if you did it. And that's what we need. And it's almost like some sort of superhero type of element that we have in society, and without it, I would still be there.
Since Kirk was exonerated, DNA tests have helped free more than 100 other people, including 12 from death row.